Women Writers of Color was born as an imperative literary and performance supplement for both undergraduate and graduate students here at the Pratt Institute. To date, we've had 3 different readings and panels focusing on anti-racism workshops using the pedagogy of Audre Lorde, as well as the inspiration of Toni Morrison, featuring Saeed Jones and Rachel McKibbins. I was going to say Rachel. This model promises to garner the attention from a wide demographic of students and faculty for the cultural discourse needed to exist as both activists and as citizens. I'll be bringing up the poets with the bio, and we'll also end with the Q&A. So they'll be reading and then they'll be speaking about how this was lived and inspired them. And if you have any questions, please prepare yourselves for the end of the performance to ask. First poet we'll be hearing from Ocean Vuong is the author of 2 chapbooks, No by Yes Yes Books, 2013, and Burnings by Mahogany Press, 2010, which was an American Library Association Over the Rainbow selection. He's a recipient of the 2013 Pushcart Prize, has received fellowships from Kundiman, Poets House, the Elizabeth Joy Foundation, and others, including the Stanley Kunitz Prize for Younger Poets. His poems have appeared in Poetry, The Nation, Quarterly West, Guernica, The Normal School, amongst others. Vuong's work has been translated into Hindi, Korean, Vietnamese, and Russian. Born in Saigon, Vietnam, he currently resides in New York City, where he reads chapbook submissions as the managing editor of Thrush Press. Also, he thinks you are perfect. That's so good. Make you feel warm, right? And you'll also be hearing from Eliza Griffiths, who is a poet and photographer. She's received her MA in English Literature from the University of Delaware and the MFA in Creative Writing from Sarah Lawrence College. She is a recipient of fellowships including Provincetown Fine Arts Work Center, Cave Canem Foundation, Vermont Studio Center, New York State Summer Writers Institute, Soul Mountain, the Malay Colony Residency, and others. In 2011, Griffiths appeared in the first ever poetry issue in Oprah's O Magazine as an emerging poet. She's the author of Miracle Arrhythmia, out on Willow Books in 2010, The Requited Distance by the Sheep Metal Press in 2011, Mule and Pear, just out in 2011 as well. And what's the new one?
Lighting the Shadow.
Lighting the Shadow. Boom. And it's available here today for purchasement. She currently teaches at the Poets House for the Emerging Fellows Writers program, as well as Sarah Lawrence College, and lives in Brooklyn, New York. Please make some noise as we begin with Ocean Vuong.
Under the House of Poetics she has built for us. I'll start with one of my favorite Lucia poems. Evening, and my dead once husband rises up from the spirit board. Through trembled air, I moan the names of our wayward sons and ask him to explain why I fuss like a fishwife, why cancer and terrible loneliness and the wars against our people, and the room glimmers as if washed in tears, and out of the mist a hand becomes flesh, and I watch as its pointing fingers spell it does not help to know. I've been writing this poem is after a series of photographs of Chinese railroad workers from the 19th century who were lynched for various infractions. And these photographs retroactively has been erased of the lynching. The lynchings are chemically removed, so oftentimes it turns into this sort of emptiness. Right? And I'm writing towards it. And there's an epigraph from the Dixie, which is the Confederate States national anthem, which says, look away, Dixieland. Look, it's just a picnic, they say. It's just summer. Look, they say, what we have made for you. There is sunlight here, light golden enough to take to the bank. There are daffodils and green grass. We have made this for you with our hands. Look at our hands, they say. There is nothing to hide, but you look closer and see in the photo 2 shadows staining the ground, 2 shadows attached to no one, no 2, a pair of holes deep in the dirt, and you wonder if they are entrances, or maybe the darkness of something higher, something already leaving. Yes, those are just birds, they say, smudges of flight, defects in the camera, a product of its time. Yes, this is all a product of the times. Look at the sunlight, they say, how it falls right through. Some things are hidden in plain sight. And these are the people, they say. This is their story. Look, there was so much space back then, and you do look. You look, and you look, and it's true. There is so much empty, so much air to be answered for, but your eyes keep returning to the 2 black moons fallen on the earth, 2 life-sized periods unspoken for. How faithful the memory of a shadow, you think. How you can almost see the author of its dark curves. Let's just keep this moving, they say. Now, if you could please look directly above you, there is still the sky. Blue as the single eye of God pressed down on us. There is nothing to hide under all this sunlight, and your hand moves to cover your throat, to make sure you are still the speaker here, to make sure this language is still yours to reck or reckon, that it hasn't pooled into 2 ink black puddles at your feet. You feel for your throat, but these are the daffodils, they say, and these are the horses. This, the picnic, where you too will end your hunger. We have retouched them for your viewing pleasure. We have touched and retouched. Now, if you could just come this way, they say, there is so much more to see. I was born in Saigon, Vietnam. During the fall of Saigon in 1975, the American radio station played as a coded message of retreat for American personnel, Irving Berlin's White Christmas. Imagine that was the radio would start playing that song and all this chaos would ensue. And so I wrote a poem with the lyrics embedded into the scene. Obad with burning sun. Milk flower petals in the street, like pieces of a girl's dress. May your days be merry and bright. He fills a teacup with champagne, brings it to her lips. Open, he says. She opens. Outside, a soldier spits out his cigarette as footsteps fill the square into a summer downpour. May all your Christmases be white as the traffic guard unstraps his holster, his fingers running the hem of her white dress, a single candle, their shadows, 2 wicks, a military truck speeds through the intersection, children shrieking inside, a bicycle hurled through a store window when the dust rises, a black dog lies panting in the road, its hind legs crushed into the shine of a white Christmas. On the bedstand, a sprig of magnolia expands like a secret heard for the first time. The tree tops glisten and children listen. The chief of police face down in a pool of Coca-Cola, a palm-sized photo of his father soaking beside his left ear, the song moving through the city like a widow, a white, I'm dreaming of a curtain of snow falling from her shoulders, snow scraping against the window, snow shredded with gunfire, red sky, snow on the tanks rolling over the city walls, a helicopter lifting the living just out of reach, the city so white it is ready for ink. The radio saying run, run, run. Milk flower petals on a black dog, like pieces of a girl's dress. May your days be merry and bright. She is saying something neither of them can hear. The hotel rocks beneath them, the bed a field of ice. Don't worry, he says, as the first shell flashes their faces. My brothers have won the war, and tomorrow the lights go out. I'm dreaming to hear sleigh bells in the snow. In the square below, a nun on fire runs silently towards her God. Open, he says. She opens. These last 2 poems, I had a friend when I was 18. I lost a friend who took his own life, and I've been meditating on that moment, and a lot of my poems have been working through that, and mostly what it means to grow up queer in America, and how some of us don't make it. So this poem is for you. It's titled, On Earth, We Are Briefly Gorgeous. Tell me it was for the hunger and nothing less. For hunger is to give the body what it knows it cannot keep. That this amber light, whittled down by another war, is all that pins my hand to your chest. You drowning between my arms. Stay. You pushing your body into the river, only to be left with yourself. Stay. I'll tell you how we're wrong enough to be forgiven. How one night, after backhanding mother, then taking a chainsaw to the kitchen table, table. My father went to kneel in the bathroom until we heard his muffled cries through the walls. And so I learned that a man in climax was the closest thing to surrender. Say surrender. Say alabaster, switchblade, honeysuckle, goldenrod. Say autumn despite the green in your eyes, beauty despite daylight. Say you'd kill for it, unbreakable dawn mounting in your throat, my thrashing beneath you like a sparrow stunned with falling. Dusk, a blade of honey between our shadows, draining. I wanted to disappear, so I opened the door to a stranger's car, you said. He was divorced. He was sobbing into his hands that tasted like rust. The pink breast cancer ribbon on his keychain swayed in the ignition. Don't we touch each other just to prove we are still here? I was still here once. The moon, distant and flickering, trapped itself in beads of sweat on my neck. I let the fog spill through the cracked window and cover my fangs. When I left, the Buick kept sitting there, a dumb bull in pasture, its eyes searing my shadow onto the side of suburban houses. At home, I threw myself on the bed like a torch and watched the flames gnaw through my mother's house until the sky appeared bloodshot and massive. How I wanted to be that sky, to fill every flight and fall at once. Say amen. Say amend. Say yes. Say yes anyway. In the shower, sweating under cold water, I scrubbed and scrubbed. I never knew ink could be so red. It's not too late. Our heads haloed with gnats, and summer too early to leave any marks. Your hand under my shirt as static intensifies on the radio. Your other hand pointing your daddy's revolver to the sky. Stars dropping one by one in the crosshairs. This means I won't be afraid if we're already here. Already more than skin can hold. That a boy laid beside a boy must make a field full of ticking. That to say your name is to hear the sound of clocks being turned back another hour, and morning finds our clothes on your mother's front porch, shed like week-old lilies. This last poem is it's off a line by Frank O'Hara in the poem Katie, in which he says, someday I'll love Frank O'Hara. I thought it was such a tender vulnerability in that statement. So I wrote a poem to myself titled Someday I'll Love Ocean. Ocean, don't be afraid. The end of the road is so far ahead. It is already behind us. Don't worry. Your father is only your father until one of you forgets. Like how the spine won't remember its wings, no matter how many times our knees kiss the pavement. Ocean, are you listening? The most beautiful part of your body is wherever your mother's shadow falls. Here's the house with childhood whittled down to a single red tripwire. Don't worry. Just call it horizon, and you'll never reach it. Here's today. Jump. It's not a lifeboat. Here's the man whose arms are wide enough to gather your leaving. And hear the moment, just after the lights go out, when you can still see the faint torch between his legs. How you use it again and again to find your own hands. You asked for a second chance and are given a mouth to empty out of. Don't be afraid. The gunfire is only the sound of people trying to live a little longer and failing. Ocean, ocean, get up. The most beautiful part of your body is where it's headed. And remember, loneliness is still time spent with the world. Here's the room with everyone in it. Your dead friends passing through you like wind through a wind chime. Here's a desk with a gimp leg and a brick to make it last. Yes, here's a room so warm and blood close. I swear you will wake and mistake these walls for skin.
I just want to say thank you so much, Mahogany and Pratt and the community here, and Ocean. Hearing you, I feel like so full right now that I just want to kind of like coast away on syllables, but I'm going to stay here. And I always find myself coming and returning to Lisa Clifton's work, and it's a gift to just for us to gather today to talk about her and to remember her. And Ocean and I were briefly saying a few moments ago that she's so present and immediate, and that we need her more than ever. We have a lot of things that we need to hear her say and remind us and to speak to her. So I'd like to read. I have too many favorite Lisa Clifton poems, but there was one that was kind of in my ear this morning. Sorrows. Who would believe them winged? Who would believe they could be beautiful? Who would believe they could fall so in love with mortals that they would attach themselves as scars attach and ride the skin? Sometimes we hear them in our dreams, rattling their skulls, clicking their bony fingers. They have heard me beseeching as I whispered into my own cupped hands, enough, not me again. But who can distinguish one human voice amid such choruses of desire? poems from a new collection of mine called Lighting the Shadow. That's out this spring from Four-Way Books. And when I think about this book, I know that some of its internal organs and some of its skeleton are directly connected to Lucille, and getting the gift of really hearing her voice and being seen by her, and her allowing and being so generous and allowing us to see her through her life, through her writing, through her poetry, and within community as well. I'm going to start with just the first poem in the book. The dead will lead you. The dead will lead you across scarred meadows, red, blue, white. The star-flung sky scrapes gold grass, unknown milk, endless the stone figures in the fields. Who will embalm our bones, shattered inside of mythologies? We are idols, praised by blood and sun. You will call and listen for the children cradled in moonlight. Side by side, their silence deranged, deflowered by ghost primers. Years pulse the skull, the ashen hills, the expanse of desert shorn with prayers. You walk alone through mirages, museums, eyelids, water, estuaries where wings repeat flight until this desire is memorized. This is what you must learn by heart. The closed flesh as commandment. A terracotta smear of fingerprints praying along the blue cave. Mercy is the pulse of lupin in a yellow field. My mother's eyes are forgotten vases of irises. Lighting the shadow, a woman crawls out beneath her own war. Ruin, I have lived inside your estate. I remember the night horses, reckless with beauty, when the trembling poured through my windows. The animals surrounded my bed as we floated through the house, the world without sail, anchor, ornament, or oar. My memory was a painted mast, filled with the inviolate breath of what history can blow apart. So, I often find myself in conversation with the dead and the living and don't necessarily make as much distinction as maybe I used to when I was younger. And kind of acknowledging recently in the last 3 or 4 years, there have been so many poets in our tribe who are on the other, in another space now, and yet they're with us and we kind of carry them along. And one of the poets for me when I was writing this book was Lucille Clifton, but it was also the poet I. And I just kept hearing her and thinking about her. And so this poem that I'm reading to you is in conversation. She has a poem called Woman to Man. And at the end of the poem, she says, I'll give you a taste of black, you won't forget. I'll take it back, I'll make you lion. And so this poem is called Woman to Lightning, after I. We rolled in flashes of God, fighting pleasure as it tore our shadows across smoke. When we burned of life, nothing was better than our purgatory of embers. I wanted a matchbox, a grandmother clock. I wanted the dark house shingled in blue and bruised wildfire. Touch me or air. How could I ever forget the shame on my floor, a birthmark of you? I covered every mirror. I grieved the squalls of our silhouettes, rising and dying, once slave. I pulled my passage over the earthly gush of swells. Revision that I was, passing through the aviary of dead poets, their naked bird ribs glittering with time, the universe pressed like a coin upon their opened eyes. Salt water poured over joyless shoulders as I was carried out of my life. Through blood I sang, and erased my name until I could only name your arrows. I've got the scars to prove it. The nights were static and strained. I left the radio low and returned to its amnesia each morning. America shining like a gun, I practiced for you. The barrel of my voice aimed at thunderheads and headless saints. The volume of my life so uneasy beneath evenings of starlight and dread. Loneliness dragged me by my hair through back rooms where emptied velvet chairs watched me struggle with this glow of light. You were happy, weren't you? I tried to grasp the fingers slipping through the smear of my dreams. My footing struck clouds. I swear I meant no harm. But you were happy, weren't you? Like the backhand of a palm flying to my face. The desire and the flying, the wing blurred. Disarming of shadow, arming of light. I wish I were like Johnny Cash and thought my heart was mine. I've worn a black suit my entire life. It suits the war my eyes ignite. My sins sit on my lap, bald, blind, desperate for the mercy of lost roads. Glottal white lines. Only smoke will take me far to nowhere. A woman living between her own burning road and a charmed God. The unmarked sky where a plague of blackbirds fell across my back like an unlit cross. I think I will just read maybe one or two more because I would love to have like a conversation and really talk about Lucille and her work and stories. I have a poem in this book that is about a wonderful moment that I had with her. I'm also a photographer, and Nikki Finney schemed so that I could travel down to James Madison University, I think in 2009, and photograph both her and Lucille together. Furious Flower, the Poetry Center there, had a week devoted to Lucille's work, and she was just radiant this entire week. And at some point she asked me to read her poem, and I thought, I can't read Lucille Clifton's poem. How would she even ask me to do that? I will fail. But she did not let me fail, and she has not failed us. So this is a little longer. I think what I will say about it is that the title is called A Word of Rescue from the Great Eyes, and that's a line from Muriel Rukeyser, who's also a poet that I'm constantly speaking to and whose work really helped me at moments in my life where I needed quite a bit of help. And so this poem is kind of in conversation and meditation with Lucille Clifton and Muriel Rukeyser, and my great-grandmother, who I was very, very close to. Her is also Lucille. So there's a doubling of Lucille's here, and the notion that Lucille literally means light. And I may skip around in it just because it's it's several pages long, but I think time-wise is good. A word of rescue from the great eyes. Where violence interrupts the assault of language and ligaments, where they connect as a third rail of sparks, blue and wide like welts of stars, the transfusion of imagery and vernacular, and the deep slurs of silence following the echo of any final word, the scraped bowl. Muriel, a man knocked me to the floor of Grand Central Station, no reason visible but the blue gold fortune above, the constellations backwards, the dead inventors insisting on divine perspective. And so the stars too were frozen in the high green dome of trains and schedules, lost loves, heaps of shelled oysters, the great clock. I remember how the book of Jarrell flew through the scissoring legs of women wearing heels and thin regrets, their bitter smell of ache and coffee. The fall drew my blood out of me, out of the book, and my lip burst, though I said nothing when my knees scraped the rail-hard ground and my head cracked against the newsprint bin, and sludge, and the man saying nothing his open hand could say better. Come and touch me, I said. Come and try to get inside of here. The mythology turned away, cat-eyed, the spotted trees prostrate in the storm. Even the animals have left here. The silence roams and the news rustles the genesis of history's black hole. The lamp of the body is the eye. It follows that if your eye is clear, your whole body will be filled with light. Lucille McKay, I will see you again. I name you here my great-grandmother, and think of you more tonight than the others who are dead and visit me. Their mouths orphaned, lonely as blossoms, your pearl hair stained your spine, pulling our story into its shadow of continents. You were buried in a sky blue dress, clip-on pearls riveted to consonants. Too much rouge, the silenced blush, is what they do to women who are freed inside their own faces. The undertaker tried his best with your peace. Did you ever have your peace? My great-grandmother's name means light, means bloodlines eroded along Virginia rocks and Tennessee country. Her sisters all passed. She was the last one. I once tangled a hard comb in her white hair. In the dream, my great-grandmother said yes, there will be another Lucille and a field of white snow, blushing with the flash of red foxes, the blessing of the boats. Muriel, I discovered where they hid, the gods on the north side of the mountain, and demanded the return of my sins to myself. I'll carry all of this and something better one day. I said and watched a beating of monarchs, the orange and black blurs forced into my own burning. Miss Lucille said, you can be a seeing woman if you want to be. See, she said, and opened her palm along my own fingers. The opaque sight arrived, and she sang Billie Holiday to her husband sometimes to laugh and pray my own eyes open when I refused to release my leash of fear. Somebody in here is so sad, she once said. Who is that? She said above the crowns of dogs in the great forest. Somebody in here is so blue, I can hear it. Later, she planted her palm against mine and smiled her Lucille smile. You must remember. And she said, tell me what you saw before. She could see the peril of an unexamined life. She closed her eyes, afraid to look for her authenticity, but the light insists on itself in the world. When the mountain inverted its immeasurable depth, and the gods could not exhume the music they buried inside of my elegies, the woman I'd become and buried, the woman I dragged through the long river and the streets, trying to love her, while her head rolled, through pyramids, asylums, and pig alleys, hunted like a chrysanthemum. When I tried to give my life away, the woman came to me and pinned me against the snow until I was blank. When I dreamed of crawling, returning to my mother and my father, all of the shredded flecks of me we never suspected as we passed through our birthright of hours and days, their own childhoods spread out next to mine in pieces of a carnal jigsaw. I lifted my own hands. I lifted my own hands. I lifted my own hands. How in the God, how like and of God, and likeness of the God, and what God? In the film about the earth colliding with the blue sphere called Melancholia, one woman shivered and wept while the other blinked inside her own lucid house. Her inevitable eyelids and hands thin as the astonishing promise of oblivion. Have you seen the unnamed hands piling upon autumn where the waves of silverfish, the white squares of prayer blowing along stained strings in a ghost town? We all remember departing and being lost and trying to return and to say it was west of paradise. No, the other way, actually. To kneel at the center of the universe's plexus, divinity in the gut of our mornings. Exiled from my own women by the mask my mother gave me, by the words my flesh took for silk, by the dance of the gods' unfulfilled hungers. Exiled from the loves I ruined, an atheist, a transvestite of syntax, an ambassador suffused and lost in broken splendor. Exiled from my own narrative, my head frozen with sorrow, I am not Salome's utterance. The gold platter tarnished with whatever her suitors devoured, the ice of the myth. Torn back like a girl's staring mouth, torn open by the life desire fails to navigate. The red and yellow water at sunset, the leaving of all that. In any language to speak is to behead the urchin black spines of our dreams, rolling beneath the water, enveloped in the narrow broth of light. Lucille, how wild, the sorrow, a swarm of hours, the joy as the hive, the men and the women who led the water back to me and remembered the words and the pictures opening and shutting me inside their freedom, the inventions and the mothers and the grandmothers, the songs that live beneath the crab across a hidden lake. The lovers were right and wrong enough in symmetry. In the film about gravity, a woman spun within a smaller universe, enveloped in stars, trapped in her flesh. She worried she was drifting. After the men left me, the woman awakened on the shoulder of a road outside of London. After the bite marks on my wrist vanished, after the visit to Bath and the regal crescent that opened to stars and stones, after the pills slipped into my drink by the kind doctors, after the other women told me to lie, to forget, to eat, to harbor gratitude instead of shame and hatred for killers and thieves. After I stood up, my flesh ripped to the bone like a solstice in winter. There was a field of yellow flowers waiting for me. No rain for hours. There was nothing I had not known before. No name for those flowers, the cadmium yellow angels bending namelessly toward the dense earth. Or what I could tell the authorities about the long clouds ribboning the rapeseed field, or the woman burning inside of a jasmine white fear. After writing nothing, sharing nothing of it with my own mind, I see it now in her palms, clear as rivers when she touched the lips and words of other women who were free. And now, you must believe me, because I am telling you first, because I am floating this giddy, anti-iambic line out to you, to the deep and the marrow of my own unquiet water where I dive with my dark joy. I tell you, it will all be enough, as I am enough.
Lucia Clifton says, I would like African American people to be proud of me and like what I do. Women, I would like them to be proud of me and like what I do. But I write for the poem. That's what I'm trying to do, serve the poem. And who is to receive it? Well. Who can receive it? Well. So who do you write for? Who are you responsible for? What are you responsible for when you write?
That's a lifeline question.
Forever.
Forever and ever and ever. I would say I agree. I mean, I write for the poems, but the writing and living that has to be done before and around, I mean, I feel it's all integrated. I mean, I think specifically, you know, I write for a reader, and I don't always need to know who that reader is. But sometimes, and very often, my reader, I feel, or who I'm writing for, are for the readers who are kind of in a kind of border country. So I write for Black women, I write for women, I write for queer, I write for poor, I write for people who have no tongue and have no means and have no money. I write for people who I will never see or meet, who are coming in the water. So, thank you.
Yeah, I think I would echo what Joe was saying. But you know, oftentimes, I don't know if other artists feel the same way. You know, there's a trust that these are things that we write towards or write for. But when it comes down to the act of writing, I think for me that question becomes irrelevant because all those desires for communication for all those people are already inherent in that commitment to the art. And so for me, I don't hear that question when I face the composition of the poem, because there's a certain finality to that question. What is it for? And I don't see my art as making something for something, but rather a correspondence with the world. And perhaps in that way, you know, the poems keep revolving for me and evolving. You know, it's not a place where things are finalized, but rather explored to their limits and testing the limits of that capacity through investigation. But at the same time, we sit down because of all the things. Like I sit down because of all the things that Rachel says. And I trust that through that commitment, I am ultimately writing for all those people.
Do you have any questions?
Question from what you were just saying, Ocean, about writing and exploring into the capacity and the limits. I'm curious, the limits and capacity of what? Of poetry form, of the words themselves. Where do you expand on that?
For me, it's seeing what language can do. That's the tool. And I think as any practitioner of any art would say, that there's an inherent faith in the malleability of material. Right? We see this in Dickinson. And part of why Dickinson was so dynamic, I think, was because she was, in a way, she rejected the mainstream, which says, you must write this way, this is how the best poem is composed. And she found her own idiosyncratic use for language and form in that. But I think you can test those limits to any area of your craft, right? In thought, particularly in inquiry, in questioning. I always think of the poem as a space where you can ask the next question, and that you can keep asking that question, and that the answer does not have to be satisfactory, but it's rather what you discover through this sort of restlessness of seeking.
I have a question for both of you, but I want to start first by saying thank you for sharing your most gorgeous art with us. I found myself taking notes, and there were lines that spoke to me vividly. Rachel, in your poem, A Word of Rescue, you said that the lamp of the body is the eye. And I wanted to know if both of you look at photographs as ways to begin the approach to a poem. And Ocean, you said in one of your poems that with the photographs of the Chinese who were lynched for various infractions, that the images were retouched so they were removed. So how do photographs speak to you, and how do they find, those stories find their way onto the page?
Okay. Yeah. Well, I think of that as photographs as any other stimulant. For me, they act as sort of portals into parts of history that are lost, and they're preserved. And I think oftentimes they can become, at their most potent, mirrors for certain happenings for the viewer. But I look at that because the photograph is part of the world and part of the world's history. I don't privilege it as something special outside of anything else, like seeing what's happening in the news, what's happening in my home, with my family, my ancestors, and the city that I live in. I see that as material that could be accessed and corresponded with for the artist.
And when I think of photographs, I think of kind of also what you were saying about kind of this kind of restlessness and inquiry, and that there is a mirroring with it, but also I also see photographs as certain kinds of photographs I make are kind of quite textual, and unlike poems that are revised and edited and shaped and manipulated, that happens with photographs, but there's this kind of witnessing that happens for me as a photographer that is nuanced, from the type of witnessing that happens to me through language. And so photographs in some idiosyncratic way have to have some residue or vestige of a reality or a real world, or that there's an agreement that even if you're creating it, you know, when I think of like studio work I do, I've made something real that I am now going to make a tripod and I'm going to make it real now. And then I'm going to alter it, or I'm going to do something with it. And then other times my task is to look at another person and make a portrait of them. And that becomes a text. And so to kind of, for me as a writer, as a poet, as a photographer, all of it's integrated. The mind that creates photographs and makes photographs is not segregated from the poet. And so these spaces kind of bleed and kind of work, and sometimes they can be very contradictory, but they work together. It's a certain kind of muscle of empathy and imagination that is happening all of the time. And I think there is, in our current culture where photography is so widespread and so accessible, we can, you know, like Ocean, I don't see it as special. It's an instrument, it's a form, and it's, you know, there's something about it though that's quite distinct from a painting. So I constantly teach and use ekphrastic assignments and things. I think that visual images can be doors and windows and ways to enter parts of ourselves that have been bricked up and closed away, because it often begins in a non-verbal conversation. But it is a narrative, there is a text that's happening. And so I'm constantly restless as a photographer. Photographs are never an answer. And for me, I rarely see them as like proof or evidence in the way that our current culture does. There's still more, you know. I mean, we use them in a way that it's like, well, here's proof that you were here. This is proof that this happened. But like history, there are so many places where there is no image and there is no photograph to say what really happened to groups of people and to individuals. And so people sometimes will rely on photographs to do work that has to happen inward and happen inside by listening and hearing people. So I spend all this, as you know, I spend so much time thinking about this, and I never have a static answer, and I don't ever think I will. It's always going to be turning over, and it's a current. It's very fluid.
Did you find that your definition changed after your summer spent photographing in the estate of William Faulkner and around the home of Callie Warren Clark? Did your definition change?
Yeah, I think it's definitely changed since then.
So we'll close with one more question. When you think of Lisa Clifton, as we think of all other poets, there's like this tangible thing that sticks out about them, some spirit of them. What would you say would be that lingering spirit of Lisa Clifton that you hope your art transcends to?
When I think of Lucille, and when I think of legacy particularly, I think of lineage. And I think lineage is something that we are a bit too detached from in the West. And I think part of Lucille's inexhaustible value for us as poets and artists is that her insistence on the importance of lineage. That we don't just manifest as individuals, that we all have histories, and those histories create the sum total of ourselves. And I think of a legacy as a house in which, as practitioners, we are able to inhabit and grow from. And what I love about Lucille is that she created a home through her poems. And through her own ancestral investigation. You know, she insists, I'm from Dahomey woman, right, with the 6 fingers, that she back to West Africa to find her roots. And I think as artists, regardless of race or ethnicity or who we are, there's always an insistence, there should be an insistence on legacy and lineage. And I think on a macro level, that format, that learning from our elders, that corresponding and collaborating with elders, right? Because the Western mythology tells us that something is only valuable once it's conquered, right? The young must dethrone the elder in order to make its own place on earth. And I think that's a very destructive vantage point. And Lucille is someone that, for me, resisted that notion again and again, and says that all art is collaboration. We wouldn't be here without communicating with each other. And through her work and the legacy of her work, she allows us a space to collaborate.
And I feel this is why I think we will be collaborating with her for a long time. I heard a lot of what you say about the Holy Woman and like the legacy in the house. And for me, when I think of her, it's just her complexity, her intelligence. I was looking through some of her books a few days ago, and in several of them, she wrote the word joy and she underlined it. And one of the things that I continue to remind myself in my own work is that joy, like there's a duality with her, and much more plurality really, but that joy and suffering are not opposite ends of the spectrum, and that they move along with each other. They're not parallel, they're not separate. That to suffer greatly is also, you have to suffer joy too. You have to cultivate your joys as profoundly as you cultivate your grief and your suffering. And that, with that kind of vantage, you can embrace how fully human you are, and it will allow you to have empathy toward others, whether they have your views or not. That there's a fundamental humanness that is happening and exploding along our frequencies every single second. Even right now in this room, it's firing off and it's electrical. And when I think about her, I hear her laughter clear as day. I just hear her she just knew how to laugh. And so one of my things is that I want to be able to look at my own pain and my own joy and to have this deep laughter and this trust that, this trust and faith in the world, in other people. It's just so important. I mean, it's such a great question. And I think as we develop and as we kind of go through our lives, what she does, what her work does, will expand and continue to stretch and kind of hold us if we want that. Which I know I do. I need it. It's more than one, but it's a profound gift.
Thank you, Rachel, Eliza, Griffiths, Vuong.